What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch Fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our quarterback rankings for Week 11 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you're new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, looking at our top 5, I've still got Josh Allen number 1 overall. He is still your quarterback number 1 in all scoring formats right now in fantasy football. 21.6 points in week 10, 330 passing yards, a touchdown, 2 interceptions, and 84 rushing yards overall. Seemed to play just fine, even with the supposed limitation from the elbow injury. I know he has been practicing in a limited capacity so far throughout the week. And on top of that, this is more than likely going to be a game with a lot of snow. But ultimately, I'm just going to put Josh Allen number 1 overall because he's been playing at such an incredibly high level all season long. It is a good matchup on paper against the Browns. I'm ultimately not really worried about the elbow injury until we see that limitation on the field. In my opinion, we didn't see it in week 10, although he did make some mental mistakes throughout this game. What I'm more worried about for Josh Allen on the week is the inclement weather on the rise there for the Buffalo Bills, but ultimately he does deserve to be quarterback 1 on today's rankings. Moving into number 2, I've got Jalen Hurts against the Colts. This is a good matchup at the end of the day for Jalen Hurts, who still finished with 22.8 fantasy points in week 10 in the Monday Night Football loss to the Washington Commanders. 175 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 28 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. I still have all the faith in the world that Jalen Hurts is going to be a productive quarterback on a week out basis. I don't think anyone has lost that faith just because Eagles lost one game. He is still your quarterback number 3 in fantasy football at the moment. This is a good matchup against the Indianapolis Colts. Patrick Mahomes comes in as your quarterback number 2 so far on the season. You could really look at these top 3 players and kind of interchange them however you like. They are really just in the top elite tier in fantasy football right now. Patrick Mahomes is playing at an extremely high level. Since week 5, he has 3 performances with 30 or more fantasy points, and in his other 2 performances he has 21 or more fantasy points. Overall in week 10, 32.1 fantasy points, 331 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 39 yards on the ground, and 1 interception against the Jacksonville Jaguars. This should be a prime time shootout on Sunday Night Football against the Chargers. I expect Patty Mahomes to perform at a very high level. All right, number 4 overall, we've got Justin Fields against the Atlanta Falcons. He can definitely argue could finish higher than the quarterbacks I've got in front of him. Fields is playing at an extremely high level. He comes in as your quarterback 4 on the season so far, even when the first 5 games of the season he had 17 or less fantasy points, with 3 of those matchups having 10 or less fantasy points. Fields has really just taken over the fantasy world by storm. Another 40-point performance in week 10 against the Lions, 40.3 points to be exact on average. 167 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, an interception, and 147 rushing yards with 2 rushing touchdowns. And he gets another great matchup this week against the Falcons. Fields is due for another phenomenal week. He is definitely in your starting lineups as we approach week 11. Lamar Jackson was on bye week in week 10. He gets the Panthers this week. It is a great matchup. He's your quarterback 6 so far on the season. I love this matchup for him. At the end of the day, while Jackson hasn't been playing at an extremely high level the last couple of weeks, I think he's due for a bounce back game. I see 20 or more points, hopefully with a higher overall ceiling like Jackson was hitting at the beginning of the season. It's a good matchup. Jackson should be in your starting lineups. I like him as the 5th overall quarterback on today's rankings. All right, 6th overall, we've got Joe Burrow, who comes in as your quarterback 5 so far on the season. Also on bye week in week 10 and week 9 against the Panthers, he had 19.1 fantasy points, 206 passing yards, and a touchdown, but he really didn't need to do anything in that game because Joe Mixon and the run game for the Bengals was going absolutely crazy. He gets the Pittsburgh Steelers here in week 11. He had 20.2 fantasy points against them in week 1. Burrow does have a tendency to turn the football over when he plays the Steelers. We know that TJ Watt is back for this unit, so I won't be surprised if he turns over the football a couple times in this game, but ultimately I think he's going to put up a good stat line, and he deserves to be pretty high on the list because he is our quarterback 5 so far on the season. I still have a lot of faith in Burrow as we begin to approach the end of the fantasy season. I got Dak Prescott as number 7 overall against the Vikings. This should be a competitive matchup. I like this game script overall, and Dak Prescott in his last 2 performances has 21 or more fantasy points. In week 10, 21.2 fantasy points, 265 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. I think that Prescott puts up another good stat line and what I believe will be another competitive game script for the Cowboys. All right, I got Justin Herbert as number 8 overall. I have some faith in Herbert. In the next 4 weeks, he gets Kansas City, Arizona, Las Vegas, and Miami, all very favorable matchups for the quarterback position from a fantasy perspective. Plus, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams have been practicing this week, so he should hopefully get one of his top pass catchers back. And once again, this is going to be a competitive game script. Sunday Night Football against the Chiefs. We should see some fireworks in this game. If you don't have better options, I say we give Justin Herbert a last chance here as he makes a little bit of a push in the next couple weeks against some bad opposing defenses. I think he's going to get it together and ultimately give you some better fantasy stat lines. All right, number 9, I've got Russell Wilson against the Raiders. It's just a good overall matchup. Russell Wilson's best and really only significant fantasy stat line of the year came in week 4 against the Raiders when he had 27.4 fantasy points, 237 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, a rushing touchdown, and 29 rushing yards. Russell Wilson has been extremely lackluster the past couple weeks. Not really a streaming option, but I do think he has a good opportunity here in week 11 against the Raiders, especially in a week where we've got Tom Brady, Tua Time, Trevor Lawrence, and Geno Smith all on bye week, and those are all starting quarterbacks at this point in the season. I think you can give Russell Wilson a shot if you don't have better options, and he's got a good matchup. All right, Kyler Murray, a little bit lower on the list. He is your quarterback 8 in fantasy football, even with missing week 10 against the Rams, but ultimately I still have faith in Kyler Murray, but he is questionable at this point in the week, and there's not a for sure start from head coach Cliff Kingsbury on Kyler Murray as he approaches this week 11 matchup on Monday Night Football. And on top of that, this Niners defense is for real. They have played well against opposing offenses and opposing quarterbacks, so it's a little bit of a tough matchup. We know that he's a little bit banged up. Just don't know if ultimately Kyler holds the most upside this week. We look at the next couple of weeks for Kyler Murray. There are some tough matchups. There's also a bye week in there, so kind of feels like almost every season this happens with Kyler Murray, where he's playing at a very high level at the beginning of the season. Then towards the end of the season, he starts to dip down in production and is always dealing with some sort of injury, which really impacts his fantasy value. So ultimately here, going into week 11, I've got him as the 10th overall quarterback. Looking at the next 5, I've got Jimmy Garoppolo against the Cardinals as number 11. He just is consistently giving us safe floors on a week in, week out basis. A little bit of a lower floor in week 10 against the Chargers with 15.9 fantasy points. No touchdowns through the air, but 1 rushing touchdown in a game where really the defense and the run game took over against the Chargers. But I think he gives us a safe floor against the Cardinals on Monday Night Football. You could definitely argue, when we're looking at these next 5 quarterbacks, they're pretty interchangeable. I think a lot of them have similar floors and ceilings at the end of the day, but I like Garoppolo against the Cardinals. Looking at Daniel Jones, who gives 18.2 fantasy points in week 10 against Houston, 197 passing yards and 24 yards on the ground, as well as 2 passing touchdowns. He's got a good opportunity against the Lions in week 11 to put up another good fantasy stat line, not a crazy high ceiling for Danny Dimes, who's fallen to quarterback 16 on the season, but a good opportunity against a weak Lions defense for Danny Dimes here in week 11. Kirk Cousins is your quarterback, 11 overall. You could argue he should be a little bit higher, but he gets the Cowboys defense that is still ultimately playing well on the season. But Kirk Cousins just gives you a safe floor on a week in, week out basis and a safe ceiling. Not a crazy high ceiling, somewhere around 23 fantasy points, but he's probably going to get you 17 fantasy points at worst, even though he has scored a little bit lower once or twice on the season. I still like him in a good competitive matchup against the Cowboys. I think he's a very safe quarterback for the week. Next up, we've got Aaron Rodgers coming in as our quarterback, 14 overall. He comes in as the quarterback 14 so far on the season. He had his best fantasy performance of the year in week 10 against the Cowboys at 19.3 fantasy points, 3 passing touchdowns, and 224 passing yards. This Titans defense, while they have a very bad secondary, they have a very good front seven and a very good run defense. It's a short week for the Packers. I don't expect a crazy high ceiling for Rodgers, but he is still someone you can consider a start if you don't have better options. Just don't expect a lot of upside as we approach the week. All right, I got Matthew Stafford, who is questionable at the moment against the Saints, as my quarterback 15. I don't love it. He had a really bad week in week 9. He didn't play in week 10. I'm not sure if he's even going to suit up against the Saints. And yes, it's a tough matchup. Yes, Cooper Kupp is out, but let's just give Stafford one last chance here, whether he plays this week or next week, to show us what he's got in the tank without Cooper Kupp. And if he doesn't perform, he's going to fall drastically on the rankings. But ultimately, like I said, we've got 4 starting quarterbacks out this week on bye weeks, so the rankings are a little bit skewed once we get to this tier. And really, when we look at the next 5 quarterbacks, they're all pretty interchangeable. So Stafford comes in as quarterback 15 as we approach the week. All right, our final 5 quarterbacks, I'm not going to break down extensively, but these are your guys who you can stream if you are absolutely desperate. There are some other quarterbacks you could argue for here, like Ryan Tannehill, who had a decent week last week, Mac Jones, Zach Wilson, I don't know, maybe Kenny Pickett or Baker Mayfield, but ultimately, a lot of these guys you're not starting outside of Superflex and double quarterback leagues unless you are absolutely desperate. I do think that Marcus Mariota has a good opportunity against the Bears. He's given us some respectable fantasy stat lines on the year and been a streaming option at times, but ultimately, he's also given us a lot of bad fantasy stat lines. Matt Ryan has a good opportunity against the Eagles, although ultimately I still will give the nod to the Eagles defense, but Matt Ryan did play well last week. Derek Carr has really been struggling. He gets a tough Broncos unit, but he's somebody who should get you 15 fantasy points if you are absolutely desperate. Taylor Heineke has a good opportunity against the Texans, but even though he managed last week's game against the Eagles very well, he still came out with single-digit fantasy points, so I don't have a lot of faith in him. Jared Goff is not playing that bad of football, I guess. At the end of the day, he's just a ultimate game manager. It's not like the Lions are winning a lot of games, so he's a tough read. He had some games this year where we could start him and consider him a streaming option, but ultimately in the last 4 weeks, he's been extremely inconsistent, looking at 3.5, 18.6, 12.3, and 14.8 fantasy points, and the Giants have played well ultimately as a defense. So he comes in as my quarterback 20, but any of these guys are pretty interchangeable, and some of the other names like I mentioned, you could consider as streaming options, but we got to throw them out here as the final quarterbacks to take a look at. Keep in mind, the Saints on the week could have a decent opportunity at the quarterback position as well, and maybe Andy Dalton or Jameis Winston should be in this tier, but we don't actually know who's starting for the Saints at the quarterback position at this point in time, so they didn't really make the list. But like I said, these are the final quarterbacks for the rankings, and there's definitely other names that could be on here as well as we approach week 11. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.